Gabriella D'Cruz, or Gabby as she is more well known in Goa. It's funny because she was just a young girl when I met her, and she was interning with Worldwide Fund for Nature at the time. And I had the pleasure of taking her through her open water course as well. And she's a real water baby, loves to dive. And of course, we were together when we did the WWF survey way back, I think it was in 2015. She's grown up a little bit since then, which is not to say that I've grown old. I've not. She's just grown older, right? So now she's armed and dangerous. She's got a marine conservationist master's in biodiversity conservation and management from the University of Oxford. She has spent the last 10 years working in marine space and is now focused on building a seaweed company called the Good Ocean. So today she is going to be talking to us and enlightening us about India's rich and biodiverse seaweed. Guys who have signed on for this, for the wrong weed, you can leave now. Okay, we are going to talk about seaweed here, all right? And she'll introduce that to us and the amazing things that go with it, and also discussing the challenges and the potential of India's growing seaweed industry. So over to Gabby. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Venkat.
Hi.
Let me just share my screen. I actually have an interesting a story from when I was actually applying for a visa to go to a seaweed conference in Ireland. And the visa embassy looked at me and they thought, brown girl, weed, what is going on here? And I almost didn't get my visa. I actually had to show them like the invite and say, no, there's such a thing as a seaweed conference. And then they were like, fine, you can go. Yeah. But yeah, thank you, Venkat, for having me. And I'm really excited actually to present to this community of people because I feel like there's a lot I can learn from you as well. This presentation will basically be a brief overview of how I got into seaweed, seaweed's general overview of the seaweed industry in India, and then conversations around policy or the lack of policy and what we need to do to move towards a more equitable, sustainable, and climate smart seaweed value chain. And I'm hoping that the question answer session will actually be something that I can also learn from. So yeah, I'm going to try and keep it not too long. And then maybe, yeah, we'll have a question answer session after. So just to start off with, I got introduced to seaweed about 5 years ago now. And that was because I was actually interested in reef ecosystems and was looking at the various stressors to reef ecosystems in India. And the Gulf of Mannar being one of our larger reef ecosystem areas and locations was one of the places I looked at. And for me, it was really interesting to see how the local seaweed industry there was in competition with the conservation of the reef. And initially, it was just looking at it through a biological lens in the sense that if we look at the image on the lower right, this Acropora coral has been covered by a seaweed species called Catophycus alvarezi. I'm sure some of you in the room today have heard about this. It's essentially an invasive species from the Philippines, but there's a bunch of contradictions with the scientific community as to how they feel about it. So some people feel like the seaweed industry in Tamil Nadu and the Gulf of Mannar is so beneficial to communities, so we have to have it. But then there's a huge community of scientists that are also opposed to the fact that seaweed could destroy coral reefs. And this was really interesting to me. And so I was interested in speaking to communities about it to understand more about the seaweed industry. And that's when I actually met quite a few women engaged in the seaweed industry in Tamil Nadu. These are, of course, Umeed Mistri's beautiful photographs. I didn't take any when I was there. And so essentially, the industry in India is quite environmentally destructive and socially exploitative right now. And that's essentially because it's a low value industry. So you're probably wondering what these women are doing and where this seaweed goes. So essentially what they do is every day they get onto boats, go out into the Gulf of Mannar, go to certain islands and free dive to collect seaweed. As you can see on the image on the right, they have very basic equipment. Some don't have gloves, some have very basic masks. This is quite a dangerous activity for them. A lot of them have not learned how to swim and have to learn how to swim on their own. And there's not a lot of institutional support at all. So really basic support just in terms of the community and how the community works together. And what these women do is they sell this seaweed to middlemen at a very low price. And this seaweed, which you can see on the right, it's quite badly processed. It's processed at very, in the open and not a lot of like safety standards or cleanliness standards. And this seaweed is then sold to the hydrocolloid industry. So if you look at the entire coastline of India, the main areas where this activity happens, Tamil Nadu is where it mainly is engaged with women seaweed harvesters, but at the coastal state of Gujarat and certain parts of Maharashtra also have communities engaged in seaweed farming and seaweed harvesting. And these coastal states then sell the seaweed to middlemen in the hydrocolloid industry. And that seaweed then ends up in products such as toothpaste, ice cream, certain types of cheeses, basically anything that requires a vegan or vegetarian gelatin. If the product doesn't use bovine gelatin, that usually has seaweed. So agar agar is a seaweed gel. China grass is seaweed. Most of the agar gel placed in labs are all seaweed-based labs. So it's used quite actively and its use is quite widespread, but we don't actually see it that way. So I think when a lot of us think seaweed, we think Asian cuisine and sushi, but we're not really thinking about the fact that there's already seaweed in your toothpaste. And so it's really interesting to start having these conversations because seaweed is not actually a very new thing. This industry has been around for a couple of decades, and it's an industry that is really hard to map in terms of its supply chain. And so it's really important that people sit together and discuss how we can do it in a sustainable way. I kind of like to think of it as sort of palm oil, not in the exact sense of palm oil, but just like there's so many products that have palm oil, there are actually quite a few products that have seaweed, but it's a really hidden product. So it's difficult to map it and difficult to see how sustainably sourced it is. So yeah, these are the three main gels that you get from different seaweed species. Carrageenan, which is in your toothpaste, sodium alginate, which is actively used now to make bioplastics in certain parts of the world, and agar agar, of course, which is used in a range of food products as a gelling agent, as well as in pharmaceutical products as well. And just for those of you who would like a brief understanding of basic seaweed biology, there are certain characteristics that you can use to identify seaweed. So when you're out diving or you're by the beach, you kind of want to look for these certain characteristics, and that'll kind of lead you to understand how to identify seaweed. So firstly, it's multicellular large algae. It's not microalgae. Seaweed is usually the larger algae, so the larger plant-like bodies that you find in the ocean, that's seaweed. It's exclusively marine, which means that freshwater algae is different. Marine water algae is usually seaweed. So for example, spirulina is a freshwater algae. It's not seaweed. And the third point is that it doesn't have any roots. So seagrass, for example, is separate from seaweed. So seagrass has roots, seaweed has holdfasts. So that's another way of distinguishing it from other species. So yeah, just like I said, the macroalgae is seaweed and microalgae is just microalgae. It's not defined as seaweed. And seaweed also ranges in terms of climatic conditions. So the one on the left that you can see is the kelp forest. Kelp usually grows much larger. For some reason, seaweed in colder climates seems to grow much larger, whereas seaweed in warmer climates, like the image on your right, these seaweeds are what I've personally found in one tide pool in Baga in Goa. And so they're a lot more varied, but they're much smaller in size as well. So this is one of the differences. So actually, depending on which part of the coast, where in the world you are, your coastline will tend to have different seaweed species. If we look at India, we have over 800 species of seaweed that have been documented along the entire coastline. And specifically in Goa, we have 145 species that have been identified, but I'm sure there's scope to identify a lot more because it's not really a space that has been explored very actively outside of the commercialization range. Basic seaweed biology, there's two means of reproduction. So if you're interested in seaweed farming, this is kind of a space that you will have to get into, is sort of understanding how to propagate seaweed. However, different species have different ways of propagation as well. But if we look at the main seaweed species that I work with, which is sargassum, it's similar to kelp. It has two means of reproduction: asexual, sexual reproduction. And when it comes to farming this species, it's also really important to look at more sexual reproduction for farming, because it means it's then more genetically diverse. And so seaweed farms will be less susceptible to a disease if they are more diverse, rather than just having asexual reproduction where you fragment certain bits of the seaweed and grow it. Then it usually means that that seaweed farm is a little less resilient. Yeah, just a point to add. There's also, so this is just a video of some of the seaweed forests in Goa. This is a very basic video, but it sort of just shows you diversity of seaweed that we have. This is at a meter, 2 meter depth. It's really shallow. This seaweed was actually at just off Dyer's Beach, so very close to the Goan coastline. This is Spatoglossum. It's a sorry, these videos are not great considering I'm speaking to a community of divers. But yeah, this is what I documented. This is Dictyota. It's another commonly found species in Goa, and very important for as a fish breeding site. You'll find a lot of biodiversity around these seaweed forests. So, like I mentioned earlier, the seaweed forests in Goa are usually they're not as large as the kelp forests that you find in colder climates, but they are very diverse, and you have multiple species in just one stretch of the coastline. So they're quite important to map in that sense. I'll just quickly also take you into the seaweed market in terms of what people are looking at and why, even as ecologists and biologists, we have to be aware of the fact that there is a growing market, and this is probably what the market will look at. Because if we look at the current seaweed market, it's a low value market, which means that a lot of the seaweed farms are over harvested. And because the value of the seaweed is very low, and so there's sort of a move to make this seaweed value chain more sustainable by maybe changing the price or getting communities on board to understand what they would like as the price, and then accordingly evolving it. But if we look at the global seaweed market, it's growing quite significantly. It's going to be worth $12 billion by 2024. A lot of this is human food, but a lot of it is also pharmaceuticals. And if we look at the market in general in India, there's a huge emerging beauty industry that's also looking at seaweed, as well as an organic food market that's looking at seaweed, because of the fact that seaweed is very nutritious and also it closely resembles skin tissue actually, which is why seaweed is used so actively for skin products, but also in terms of treating third-degree burns, treating some kind of cancers, because of the fact that algal tissue is very similar to that of like gut tissue in humans and skin tissue in humans. So this kind of, the uses of algae are sort of moving towards these higher value markets as well. And there's also a growing fertilizer industry in India, which is probably going to mimic the hydrocolloid industry in the sense that it's high extraction and low value. But that seems to be the trend right now, where there's quite a few small companies along the coast that are harvesting seaweed to use in the fertilizer industry as well as the animal feed industry. But again, none of this is very well regulated. If we look at policy right now, there's currently no policy for seaweed in the country. There's supposed to be a draft policy being made, but I personally don't have access to it, and I don't really know anyone who does. And I'm not sure who it is who's compiling this. And I feel like there has to be some kind of involvement from experts as well as communities that are actively involved with it, but so far it doesn't seem to have happened. However, there is potential to grow the seaweed industry in a sustainable way. Other countries have used certification schemes. So for example, there's the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, which is the sister organization of the Marine Stewardship Council, which certifies close to 13 to 14% of global fisheries. There are many issues with certification schemes. primarily that they are very exclusive, they're very expensive, they normally leave out small-scale farmers, so they may not be the best thing for an emerging industry like seaweed, but there could be a possibility to have some kind of a guideline put into place where small-scale farmers can possibly do what is called a landscape approach to certification. So farmers from a particular region could get together and then follow certain guidelines, and therefore the seaweed in that region is known to be sustainable because everybody in that region follows guidelines. So that's possibly an example, but this is being done in other parts of the world, and the seaweed industry is being monitored right now, but in India, not so much. And that's definitely a cause for concern, because it means that we might actually lose a lot of the very rare and very sort of slow growing species that we have along our coastline. But if we are to grow this industry, I don't think it's possible to do it from wild harvesting like it happens right now. We will have to start farming seaweed and farming it in more integrated, more biodiverse, more similar to oceanic ecosystems. And one way of doing this is, of course, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. This is something that has been carried out in other parts of the world. I personally don't know of any examples in India, but it could be integrated. It's very similar to how oceanic ecosystem functions anyway. So like the image says, it's essentially combining different forms of aquaculture or using existing aquaculture setups to then add more species onto it. So for example, if we look at it in terms of the Indian context, we have a lot of shrimp farms, and shrimp farms release a lot of nutrition into rivers, which results in a lot of pollution. One way of minimizing this pollution would be to integrate seaweed into shrimp farm ecosystems. So you actually have tanks that grow seaweed. This, of course, would mean that your shrimp farm would have to be very close to the ocean, because you do need a high salinity for seaweed to grow. But there are quite a few farms that are very close to the sea. And so it could be a way of bioremediating a lot of shrimp farm waste, but it's also a way of actually value adding to your farm, because then you not only produce shrimp, you also produce seaweed. And so you have a wider market, and you're also saving money in terms of then not having to invest in a lot of technology to clean the water before it's put out into the rivers. So that's one way of integrating it. Another way, of course, is to grow seaweed and mussels. So in Goa, at least, the mussels grow around the same time that seaweed grows, and certain species of seaweed. And it's very easy to integrate both of them. I think the NIO had actually done a study a few years ago where they wanted to do mussel rafts out at sea. So they put up a bunch of rafts, and they found that there was so much seaweed growing on the rafts that it actually broke, like a lot of the rafts broke with the weight of the seaweed. But that's the example that I got. But it goes to show that seaweed and mussels grow in and around the same area, and it's possible to have an integrated system of that sort where we have multiple produce that comes out of it. And in terms of fishing communities, it's also more beneficial, because a lot of the policies right now that are focused towards livelihood enhancement are usually single species. And so if that species gets affected by some climate change related issue, if there's a disease, if the market fluctuates, then the community is usually left to be very vulnerable. Whereas if we integrate more species into marine aquaculture or integrated systems, then there's obviously a little more of a buffer for communities where they can sell one product if another one is not selling. So mussels and seaweed is another very exciting prospect. It's something I'm really interested in getting into. And that's essentially what India has the potential to do, is a lot more integrated aquaculture instead of more extractive fisheries. And so if we look at this in general, there is a huge potential for seaweed in India, but there's a lot of red flags as well in the industry right now, starting with the fact that it's quite environmentally destructive at the moment and very exploitative for coastal communities. So I think if I were to ask the question, how do we build an equitable and sustainable value chain for India for seaweed? It would definitely start with better consultation with coastal communities. So definitely getting coastal communities on board from the get-go to then have consultations with them and understand what are the different issues they have with the industry, how can we improve it, how can we include them in the value chain as well. And then the other point is also looking at provenance. So where does your seaweed come from? How clean is the water? What are the guidelines that have to be carried out to make sure that the seaweed is harvested properly? All of that needs to be put into place as well. And then thirdly, of course, is actually coming up with a rigorous and robust seaweed policy for the country, but also possibly policies that are individual along the coastline, because maybe Goa has a different way of seaweed farming than maybe Tamil Nadu. And so it would be interesting if these policies could vary across coastal states. And so these are essentially the paths in which we have to go to really build this equitable value chain. And there are multiple actors, of course, that have to take part, one of whom is actually a lot of people from the diving community, mainly because a large number of seaweed forests have not been mapped. And so I'm actually curious to know if you have any experience with mapping seaweed, if you have any tips on how to do it, if you have any recommendations, because starting from the seaweed season that's going to start in Goa from November, I'm really curious to start mapping seaweed. So far, I've just been doing it more like a hobby in terms of just photographing the species I find. But I really do feel like there has to be a robust way of documenting it, especially because I was just telling Venkat earlier that I was in a 5.5-hour meeting this morning with the Goa Coastal Zone Management Authority, and they were talking about how the CZMP maps actually don't map seaweed. They have a provision to map seagrass, but there's literally no provision to map seaweed. And even though seagrasses, which are very similar to seaweed, come under the CRZ1A, which is the highest protection, seaweeds are not under this provision. And so it's so important to not only push governments to include seaweed in these important ecosystems, because they're very, very important for fish breeding, very important for carbon sequestration, very important for coastal community livelihoods, and then have a robust way of monitoring and mapping these seaweed forests across the country. So that's essentially where I'm going to leave this at. I'm also going to end with the fact that I'm normally harvest seaweed from around Keli. That's where I hand harvest it, because the water quality is better here. I used to harvest from around Anjuna Vagator, and the water quality there is really bad because of the fact that we have a lot of sewage coming through from the shacks as well as rivers. But I'm really interested in starting a kind of pilot seaweed farm. And so, like I was talking to Venkat earlier, I'm curious to know if anyone from this community has also been thinking about this, and if anyone has inputs on how this could be done in a just in an environmentally sensitive way. I'd be curious to know. So I guess if we could open it up to questions and comments, that would be amazing. I'm going to charge my laptop.
Great, thank you, Gabby. That was very informative. I think very few people, including divers, they don't know much about seaweed, even though we see it on a daily basis, particularly in our dive sites. For example, how many species did you say were in Goa? I didn't get that.
145.
I still can't believe it. 145.
And we have 800 across the rest of the coast of India. So there's so much actually.
Jesus. Okay, that's
you should make a whole seaweed course on your SSI ecological diver.
No, you will be making it. We will run.
Done.
Okay. Okay, guys, are there any questions? It's open now. Aditya Lad has a question. Is there any guidebook for seaweed identification?
Yeah, there are a couple of guidebooks. We have one for Goa, but the lady who's published it is sort of, she hasn't really come up with new editions. I'm not sure about a guidebook for the entire country, but usually if you're along a particular coast, there will be someone who has documented it for that particular coast. There is one frightfully expensive book, which I'll put the link in the chat. It's like $7,000 for a book, but it is quite comprehensive in terms of documenting seaweed. But another good way to do it is actually iNaturalist as well, because a lot of local people have documented the seaweed along various tide pools and have logged it on iNaturalist. So that's another way of an interactive way of also learning about seaweed species.
So you've talked about seaweed in India. Globally, how many varieties are there? That's
a good question. In the thousands, but I'm not exactly sure how much. I did know this answer, but I'm so tired today that I've forgotten the exact number. Okay. But definitely in the thousands. Yes.
Okay. So Shirish asks,
Yeah.
can it be grown by recombinant DNA technology? That went way over my head, but I'm sure you know something
Okay.
about it.
I don't actually know what recombinant DNA technology is. If Shirish could
Shirish,
actually,
1 minute, let me
that,
try and unmute him. So Shirish, if you can unmute yourself and come online, please.
Yeah, good evening. Am I
Hi,
audible?
Shirish. Hi.
So basically, this is something like making something in a petri dish in the lab. If you can make something, say one clone, and then you just multiply it by recombinant DNA, what we do, or say, what we do for the virus or anything, you take a
So
part
it's
of
like
the DNA.
culturing it, is it?
Yeah, something like culturing, genetic culturing. So that way it enhances the process. And there are some, I think, some plants are grown by recombinant DNA. So there anything going on? I just so why the question? I know.
Gabby?
it's possible, I'm sure, but right now there's actually not even enough research to look at even native species. So, for example, the main seaweed species that's promoted in India is Capophycus alvarezi, which is the native invasive, non-native invasive species that has been promoted. But some scientists are working on local species as well. So I guess if there's more funding put into seaweed production and farming, there would probably be, yeah, it could be explored. But right now, for example, if someone wanted to start a seaweed farm, you would have to have a lab set up. You'd have to have some kind of a like a hatchery to get seaweed spores and put it onto ropes to put it out at sea. So there is a lot of infrastructure that's already missing. But I'm assuming, if there is more funding, I'm sure there are some scientific organizations that would be doing this. But I'm not personally aware of it.
Because in the long run, recombinant DNA technology is cheaper than doing it, in next to the sea, where we can really reproduce it fast. Once you know the genetic structure of the organism of the plant, you just have to multiply.
So you mean grow it in a lab, like on a land-based system?
Maybe and just grow them. They grow really fast.
Right. There are a couple of seaweed farms globally that do that. There's one in Israel. It's called Sikura. So I don't know if they do it with DNA recombinant technology, but what they do is they have these large tanks, and the whole seaweed farm is very close to the sea. So they pump in seawater on a regular basis. They monitor the pollution levels, they monitor salinity and all the other parameters. But the seaweed is grown on land, which means that they can grow it all through the year. Whereas with the industry in India, because it's mainly oceanic, it's obviously limited to when there's no monsoon, and that kind of limits the industry as well. But land-based seaweed is expensive, like very expensive. And right now with the market being so low value, it's not really worth it as of now. But should the market get more interested in, say, nutraceuticals, high-end food products, then there's a possibility that there will be enough money to invest in land-based systems. But right now, the most logical way to do it is to farm it out at sea, cost-wise.
Happy with that, Shirish? Anything else?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So Sanjay, aka Ned Verma, is asking, I'm interested in mapping when the season opens. So you're welcome to join us.
Great.
We will be organizing it with Gabby.
Yes.
And we'll open it up for all the dive centers. Whoever is interested in coming, we can certainly have them on board. Ned also asked, I know sargassum and padina. I could not understand the name you mentioned on the video because of sound issues. So if you can.
Sure. So there's sargassum, padina, spatoglossum is the sort of the thicker one that was on the second video. And then there's dictyota as well. And there's a range of others. If I'm not sure if you live in Goa, but in Goa we have like 145. I will not list all of them, but there are quite a few seaweed species that are visible from a low tide, so you don't even have to dive to see them. And a large number of them are edible. So you should actually, you should just maybe go foraging, but of course, don't harvest too much, just harvest very little.
Right. Okay, so Siddharth Raju asks, can you elaborate on the difference between seagrass and seaweed?
Yes.
Also, Could you talk about the ecosystem and or food chain which are dependent on seaweed?
Right, sure. So seagrass, essentially, the easiest way to distinguish the two is seagrass has roots and seaweed has a holdfast. It doesn't have roots. It takes its nutrients from the seawater, whereas seagrass usually gets its nutrients from the substrate, from the soil that it's present around. And seagrass is a plant, seaweed is an algae, so that's another difference. Seagrass is actually strangely more, maybe because this number of species are not so much. So for example, in Goa, we have two main species of seagrass, whereas species of seaweed. So maybe that's a reason why it has more protection status. I'm not sure. But seagrass meadows are also incredibly important for certain species that don't use other ecosystems to feed on. But in a similar way, seaweed forests are also incredibly important as fish feeding sites. They are sort of the base food for a lot of marine creatures. They're also refuges for transient marine creatures. So sea turtles usually use seaweed forests to like rest in or hide in or feed in. And they're also huge carbon sinks. So a significant amount of carbon can be absorbed by seaweed forests and then trapped in the lower strata of the ocean.
They also are form nurseries, is that correct? Just
Yeah.
like mangroves, perhaps, yeah?
Just like mangroves, just like coral reefs, they are definitely important biodiversity aggregators in the ocean and important spaces, like safe spaces for fish to breed and feed.
Okay. So Kshitij is asking a question which I think you've partly answered anyway, but I'm going to read it. Can we find seaweed further inland in Goa, say along the mangroves, estuarine habitats? And is it harvestable without diving along the beaches? Or on the same line, how deep waters do they need to thrive?
Yeah, good question. So right now, because the salinity in the higher reaches of the rivers, so for example, where you have mangroves, the salinity lower, so we don't have seaweed around that area. Possibly with climate change and with saline ingress, they might start growing further towards the inner reaches of the river mouths, but that's probably not a good thing because they're not really specialized to survive in these areas. So right now the answer is no, we don't have seaweed in the higher reaches of the river mouths. But where the river mouths meet the sea, like where the salinity is high enough, so I think 28 ppt and above, we actually have a lot of seaweed. So for example, the Donapola river mouth or the Mandavi river mouth, the Zuari river mouth are full of sargassum because they not only get the nutrition that comes down from the river, but they also have the right salinity from the ocean. And so that creates really huge seaweed forests. And sometimes they can be quite aggressive because the more nutrition they have, dominant seaweed species usually grow. And so that, I guess, like Venkat, I'm sure you've seen a lot of padina growing along the coral reefs in Grand Island. They're like these world seaweed. And that usually happens when there's lots of nutrition. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So to answer about the other end of your question, you can harvest them at low tide, pretty much on any rocky substrate along the coast. But it's also really important to know the species that you're harvesting before you harvest, mainly because some are very rare and some might not be edible, and you don't want to harvest it right from the holdfast. So never pull a seaweed off from the root because then it can't grow again. So always cut it from a certain height above the holdfast. And these are all guidelines that actually have to be set and have to be put out because, especially for example, if you tell a chef that there's seaweed along a certain tide pool, then you have no control over how much people will harvest because there's no regulatory body right now except maybe the Goa Biodiversity Board and the biodiversity boards. So just be cognizant of the fact that you might be over harvesting, and if you are going to a tide pool, just harvest very little or just as much as you need.
Okay, so Mayuresh has got a question. How does the economics of seaweed farming work? How much space is required for a farm to be profitable, etc.?
That's a really good question. I don't actually know because it depends on your market. So for example, if you're providing seaweed for a hydrocolloid market, the seaweed will sell for as low as 15 to 20 rupees for a kg of seaweed, which means that you then have to look at what you want to earn from it. And it's usually very low. The margins are usually very low. And so that's not a very sustainable way for the industry to go. But for example, if you're selling to a high value nutraceutical market, you're selling to chefs, if you're selling to a beauty industry, then while your safeguards for the seaweed will have to be more stringent, your water quality will have to be better, your post-processing will have to be better, then you could possibly sell your seaweed for a higher price. But right now, the price is usually set by the supply chain or the hydrocolloid supply chain. So it's set by middlemen. So there's a big question right now as to who gets to set the price. What will this price be? Are some seaweed species valued over others? Because seaweed is as diverse as like bananas and potatoes. You know, you can't categorize them as the same thing. Yeah, so that's a question that has to be answered, but it's a lot more niche than that. So say, for example, you wanted to start a seaweed farm in coastal Maharashtra, you would also have to do it in consultation with the local community, understand what the community wants to be paid, and then understand how to grow your seaweed. But if you're looking at the raw cost of starting a farm, it's really not much. I mean, I will be talking to Venkat about this, but it essentially means putting a couple of rafts out in an intertidal area and then mooring it to either an existing tide pool or having, you know, designated mooring buoys, and then possibly just free diving to monitor the rafts occasionally. So it's very similar to mussel farming in that sense, which is not very expensive. Okay. So this setup is not expensive. It's more in terms of the labor to manage the seaweed farms, and then how much you actually value the seaweed for, and what industry you sell it to.
Okay. Jeremiah has got a question. Hi, thanks for this talk. I'm a diver in the US, former resident of India. I'm curious if you're familiar with Bren Smith's paradigm for buoy rope-based systems and harvested from boats, and if this has been explored in India. Is there a native species that would be a good candidate for this, replacing sugar kelp used in the West?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, that's something I'm trying to do. So Bren Smith, you know, Bren Smith runs Green Wave, which essentially teaches a lot of farmers in the US how to farm seaweed and how to switch from, say, fisheries into seaweed farming. And it's been a hugely successful model. And it would be amazing if we could have a model like that in India. So if you were to replace sugar kelp, the closest species that you could use is sargassum, because it's not only similar in terms of taste profile actually, but also in terms of how it grows and the fact that it grows really large and it's very biomass wise, you get a lot of seaweed. Whereas if you were to grow gracilaria or, you know, smaller seaweed species, you may have to use raft methods or another method. So for long lines, sargassum is a great species to start with. It's also one of those that you can experiment with because there are a lot of species within the genus. And so there's a lot of different taste profiles to experiment with. So just like you have sugar kelp and laminaria and alaria, you have other seaweed species that you can also experiment with. But if I were you, I would start with sargassum, and we could definitely do it in a long line method. The only gap right now is that we don't have labs that extract seaweed spores from the sea and then put it onto long lines, so then you can put it out in the ocean. So very possible, but the industry will have to morph to training people how to free dive to set up these long lines, training people how to harvest from boats, and training people how to use seaweed spores and then put them on the ropes and then put them outside. Not impossible, but definitely a gap that will have to be filled by some research organization. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
On that note, Gabby, just something I wanted to share. Karen was diving in Gili Islands of Bali a long time ago, probably in the early 80s or 90s. And there was a British couple who was running a dive center there.
Okay.
And they had actually weaned the local fishermen off fishing by introducing them to seaweed farming. And they had found a market for them with some Swiss pharmaceutical companies who were buying the product. So, you know, they set up the entire supply chain for them and gave it to them. So they found that it was much more revenue generating than fishing. So that was a very good operation that they were running. I don't know whether it's still in existence at the moment, but this was way back, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And that's awesome that they started doing it at that time. So hopefully something like that could be introduced in India, which can take the pressure off overfishing along the coast, at least.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I think, like I said before, it has to be integrated so that
Yeah.
it's not just these large seaweed farms that are monocultures, but maybe
Sure.
seaweed, mussels, lobster, certain type of low trophic fish that's also maybe produced in like a fishing zone that's managed by local fishers. That would be utopia, but
Well, we have to hope and we have
yeah,
to pray. It'll happen. It'll happen.
artificial reef.
Yeah. Tanya's got a question. Are all seaweed edible or used for its benefits they provide? Is there any toxic seaweed as such?
Yeah, so not all are edible. There are some toxic species. I'm not sure if there's a large range that are also, like, for example, how people are allergic to, say, shrimp. I've not really heard of people being allergic to seaweed. So if a seaweed is edible, usually it's fine. I don't know the exact name of the species that we have in Goa, but it's really rare. I've not really seen it in many of the tide pools, but I will get back to you about this one. But as far as I know, the species that I harvest, which are about 10 to 15, are completely edible. And there's just a small percentage of seaweed that are not edible that are usually not easy to find. But as a rule, you can harvest and eat seaweed species that are larger. It's usually the smaller filamentous seaweed or like the unicellular algae that's usually more risky because they usually have more toxins in them.
Do they also tend to sort of accumulate the more unsavory things which are in the
Yes.
rivers, like
Yes.
mussels do?
Yes.
So that could also be a problem, right? Even it could be an edible species,
yeah,
but given where it's growing,
yeah.
if you don't test it and make sure that it's safe.
Yes, that's a really good point. Actually, when the Fukushima reactor exploded in Japan a couple of years ago, they had to test the seaweed for radioactivity because it did pick up a lot of that from the water, and they did find quite a bit of it in the seaweed. And similarly, because Goa is a mining state, and even though mining is shut right now, we do have to test the seaweed for heavy metals because there could be remnants, just like in mussels, they could also be in seaweed. Because seaweed is a very good bioremediant. It really absorbs a lot of the things from the water, but that means that if there's something, a heavy metal in there, then it probably will absorb it and it will increase with the amount of seaweed you eat. But in terms of the biological parameters, so E. coli and things like that, that doesn't get into the seaweed. So washing the seaweed or post-processing after can actually clean it of some kind of sewage-related pollution. And that's, I guess that's good to know because there are very few coastal stretches now that don't have sewage pollution, which is really sad actually, but that is the reality right now because we don't have good sewage management. But ideally, if you do have a seaweed, you do want to go to cleaner stretches. So I go to the northernmost beaches or the southernmost beaches where there's not many river mouths.
Great. Aditya asks, what does exactly mapping mean?
Yeah, so actually, that's something I was going to talk to Venkat about, and it's something that we've been exploring with a company called Tech for Wildlife. And just like you'd map corals, so sort of transect surveys, that's something you'd probably have to do with seaweed. But the downside of this is that seaweed is usually in tide pools that are very rough. So the water, I mean, it's usually quite hard to access these areas because they're quite dangerous. Whereas with reefs, they're usually deeper down, so you're not in that splash zone. So there are a couple of challenges with mapping seaweed, but it would basically probably include quadrat surveys or transect surveys to then map the presence, location, and the type of seaweed species that we have. So even though certain scientific papers document where they have seaweed, it's not a very comprehensive documentation. And so say, for example, if you had an industry that came in and wanted to harvest seaweed, we don't have baseline data to say we have X tons of seaweed along this coastline. And that's why it's so dangerous pushing the market when we don't have the seaweed mapped. Because then once you lose the seaweed, it's really hard to then assume what the baseline data was. Yeah, so mapping would be
the first step.
The first step for sure. Yeah.
Okay, Mayuresh asks, do seaweed farming require things like antibiotic treatment, etc.?
No. And that's another reason why if we are getting into seaweed aquaculture, we should have it as integrated as biodiverse as possible, so no monocultures, and possibly, encourage other fisheries, like, for example, a lot of cage fisheries seems to have quite a lot of issues in terms of having to give fish antibiotics and treat diseases. So try and minimize that kind of aquaculture and have a more integrated approach to it, which is very possible and is actually more biodiverse. So I have a friend, Nisha, who works on converting shrimp farms into biodiverse mangrove fishing farms. And so what they do is they basically integrate shrimp farming into crab farming and fish farming in a mangrove setting. And they found that the productivity is so much more, the disease is so much less. Yeah, sure, you can't guarantee the exact size of the shrimp, but then I guess the market also has to be, has to evolve to accommodate these shifts in consumption. And I'm sure people now are getting a lot more conscientious. So I'm sure there's a market for people who would like to have more sustainable fisheries and don't mind either paying a higher price for it or not getting the exact same quality that they always get.
Correct. Okay. So Mayuresh is continuing with it. Nearshore waters are commons. However, the seaweed farm is principally a private venture. So do you see there might be a conflict for space between seaweed farmers and nearshore fisherfolk?
Yes, and that is one of the most important points, actually. That was the concluding points of the seaweed summit that we had last week. And Aaron Lobo actually flagged this. And what he said is that because the inshore areas are the commons, and because seaweed farming tends to be very intensive for industrial use, there could be a large company that comes in and just decides to grow massive amounts of seaweed and then incorporates onto the spaces of traditional fishermen. And there are some examples, actually. I think there's a company in Bangalore called C6 Energy. I don't know where they're at in terms of how large the company is, but the website is quite terrifying. They have this huge, almost like it just looks like one of these huge ocean cleaning machines, but it's apparently like a seaweed harvester. And it's this massive machine that looks like a huge lawnmower that's just like going through the ocean. It looks terrifying. But also clearly the funding going into that project is huge funding, and it's most definitely not in consultation with fishers. It seems to be very mechanically done. And so totally, that's a very, very valid point. And another reason why, if we are to build seaweed farms, we have to start with incorporating it into the fishing community first, and really getting the fishing community on board and getting their consent before it started. And that would be the most logical way to do it. So really doing it top down and incorporating the fishing community into the policy from the get-go.
Right. Okay. Tanya, I think you've got another diver ready to help with the diving. So thank you for a great presentation. Also would love to join from Macton.
Yes.
Okay. I think we've run out of questions for the moment. Anybody else out there still looking for some answers? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Actually, I have questions for everyone else as well. So I actually wanted to know, so I'm trying to look at whether I can start a pilot seaweed farm by the end of this year. And I'm looking at Keri, so that's the northernmost beach of Goa, because that has the cleanest water right now, at least from the tests that I've done. And I'm wondering what the least damaging way would be to set up like a mooring buoy or some kind of a raft-based or a rope-based system. And if anyone has worked in this space before, I'm sure Venkat you have, and if you had any tips as to how that.
So we have put mooring buoys for boats. I don't see why we can't do the same for the rafts. It's quite easy. It's a simple technology that we're using. The only issue I see is with the ones that we have done for the boats, we have actually drilled straight into the sand.
Right. Okay.
And that's easy because you can literally drive it in by working your way like a corkscrew into the sand. But if seaweed grows only near rocky substrates, that might be a bit of a problem, because making holes into that is a nightmare, and you would need special tools which work underwater. And so that would have to be something which we need to factor in. But for example, even if we can create a substrate underwater on a sandy patch, for example, we could put in rocks to provide purchase for the seaweed. And along the perimeters, we could possibly put the anchors
Right.
and create a raft on top. So I think
Right.
that could work. But of course, depends on the scale that we are looking at and how big the thing would be. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm actually quite excited to do a small pilot. And that actually, I think Mayuresh has another question. Actually, is also something I'm looking at right now. So there's no guideline for, at least for Goa, it's a complete gap. I'm assuming that the bodies you would have to talk to would be the forest department, the fisheries department, and the captain of ports. And this is probably the case in the other coastal states as well. But as of now, there's no guideline. But you could also possibly look at the mussel cultivation legal protocol and then possibly follow that as well, because it's similar. How you grow seaweed would be similar to how you grow mussels, and it would be in and around the same area as well.
Okay.
But yeah, huge gap in terms of the legal framework.
Okay. And yeah, I think you covered Sid's question, which was the difference between sargassum and padina, or the other types of seaweed, which you have touched on already.
Yeah.
So, right, guys, anyone else? Coming close to 8:30, I can see Gabby is getting hungry for her seaweed dinner. Okay.
I wish I ate more of it, but I don't.
Thought you were trying them all out on your plate first.
Yes, actually, when it's seaweed season, I eat quite a bit of it. But so it's going to start again in November, and then it goes on till April. That's at least the sargassum season. So I do eat a lot of it then. But now, yeah, I don't.
So we shall have a seaweed dinner date.
Most
sometime.
definitely. Yeah, for sure.
With several species on the menu.
Recipes, actually, there are quite a few. But the easiest recipe is, of course, if you do have sargassum. I think, let me just see if I can. Anyway, it's a brown seaweed species. You usually find it most commonly along the beach. Don't harvest it from the beach. You harvest it from a tide pool and a clean one, and then wash it thoroughly. But if you dry it and then blitz it in the mixer, you can make like a seaweed seasoning that's amazing. Like you can just put it in your soups, put it on pizza. So anything that you would replace oregano with, just put the seaweed in. So eggs on toast, all of that. And it's just a great way of getting your iodine and all, like a bunch of basic vitamins and minerals also in that. So yeah, just making, it's called furikake in Japanese. So furikake is basically seaweed with sesame and chili. And as a seasoning, it's just amazing. So hopefully I'll make some furikake and sell it to you guys sometime soon.
Good. So Sanjay, you can probably Google it. I'm sure you'll get a lot of recipes. I'm sure there's a lot floating around. Just make sure you don't pick up the dangerous varieties and start tucking into them. Cool. All right. Anything else, guys? We'll let Gabby go. She's had a very, very long day. And I saw somebody running away in the background. Are you hiding somebody in your wardrobe, Gabby? I need to have a talk with your dad about this. Cool. Thank you so much for joining us and enlightening everybody about this. I'm sure we'll try and do something about this. We'll have a talk next week.
For sure.
And discuss it in detail. And let's see how we can kickstart this in Goa. All right.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Good night.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.